Visualize a bound man kneeling in the scorching dirt of a frontier town, his bare back already striped with welts from previous lashes. Two figures loom over him, one in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, whip coiled and ready to strike again, the other in a vest gripping a rope tethered to the prisoner's bound wrists. Behind them, townspeople gather in a semicircle, their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and cold determination, as they watch another stroke land with a sickening crack. This wasn't entertainment for the sadistic. It was business as usual for communities trying to survive. From the 1850s through the early 1900s, frontier justice operated on a simple principle. Punishment must be visible, immediate, and severe enough that no one would dare test the boundaries again. In territories where the nearest lawman might be 300 miles away and a judge even farther, settlers created their own courts, their own codes, and their own executioners. These weren't aberrations of justice. They were the system itself, built on the belief that order could only be maintained through terror carved into human flesh. The American frontier didn't just demand harsh measures. It demanded witnesses to those measures, creating a culture where violence became both punishment and public ritual. Those who broke the fragile rules of frontier society paid prices that transformed their bodies into permanent warnings, living testaments to what happened when you challenged the collective will to survive. Frontier courts and swift sentencing. Long before courthouses dotted the western landscape, justice traveled on wagon wheels, and it moved fast. Wagon train companies crossing the vast territories elected their own councils, granting fellow travelers the power to serve as judges, jurors, and executioners. These mobile tribunals handled everything from petty disputes to capital murder, often reaching verdicts within hours of an offense being committed. The speed wasn't a bug in the system, it was the feature. When you're hundreds of miles from the nearest territorial authority and survival depends on maintaining order within your traveling community, deliberation becomes a luxury no one can afford. In 1859, John Stoefel murdered his brother-in-law over a dispute about gold dust in Denver, a settlement that boasted barely 150 buildings. Within 48 hours, he was convicted, sentenced, and hanged. 1,000 spectators gathered to watch, nearly 7 times the number of structures in the entire town. The execution became the social event that defined early Denver, a demonstration that this raw settlement could enforce consequences as swiftly as any established city back east. The speed precluded any possibility of mercy, second thoughts, or correction of errors. Justice moved at the pace of fear. Some judges built entire reputations on this efficiency. Isaac C. Parker, who presided over the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, sentenced 160 men to death by hanging during his 21 years on the bench. 79 of those sentences were actually carried out, earning him the moniker, the hanging judge, and transforming Fort Smith into a place synonymous with swift death. Individual judges gained fame not through legal brilliance but through body counts, their legacies measured in the number of men they sent to the gallows. These makeshift courts operated on practical necessity rather than legal precedent. Justice wasn't blind, it was watching, and it wanted everyone else to watch too. The searing hiss of hot iron against flesh served a dual purpose: identify the criminal and terrify everyone watching. Frontier communities borrowed the practice directly from livestock management, treating human bodies as property to be permanently labeled. In 1790, at Jonesboro, Tennessee, John Wilson and Joseph Fulsome were convicted of horse theft, a particularly serious crime in a society where losing your horse could mean losing your life. They received 39 lashes on the pillory before the hot iron came. Their right cheeks were branded with the letter H for horse thief, their left cheeks with T for thief. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the blood still dripping from the whipping, creating a sensory memory that witnesses would carry for years. The practice had deep colonial roots. As early as 1640, Virginia courts ordered runaway slaves branded with the letter R on their cheeks. Thieves received a T seared into their foreheads or hands, creating walking advertisements of their crimes. Every community they entered would immediately know what they had done, making redemption or rehabilitation effectively impossible. The brand became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Rejected by legitimate society, branded individuals often had no choice but to continue down criminal paths. The mark served as both punishment and prophecy, a permanent promise that society would never forget, never forgive, and never allow the person beneath the scar to become anything more than their worst moment. The crack of the whip became the soundtrack of frontier justice, a sound that echoed through town squares and into the nightmares of anyone who heard it. English settlers brought their flogging traditions to the New World, and whipping posts soon stood prominently near courthouses and on town commons, constant visual reminders of what awaited those who challenged community order. The instruments varied by offense severity, simple leather whips for minor infractions, but the notorious cat-o'-nine-tails for more serious crimes. This multi-thonged weapon was designed with cruel efficiency, each strand capable of stripping skin independently, maximizing both pain and scarring. The number 39 held ritual significance, derived from the biblical standard of 40 stripes minus 1. This calculation was meant to prevent accidental death while still delivering maximum suffering, lending religious justification to systematic brutality. In 1846, a witness writing to the Raleigh Register described watching two men receive their 39 lashes, their skin left rough with welts and covered with blood. Even he admitted to being repulsed by the humiliating spectacle, yet the practice continued unabated. Offenses ranged from public drunkenness and brawling to theft and assault, anything that threatened the fragile social order. On wagon trains, violent criminals were stripped and beaten before their traveling companions, turning punishment into mandatory community participation. Unlike branding or mutilation, whipping scars could sometimes be hidden beneath clothing. If offenders relocated and kept their shirts on, they might rebuild their lives somewhere their past remained unknown. But the memory of being stripped naked before your neighbors, screaming as flesh tore from bone, that memory proved as permanent as any scar. The whipping post represented frontier society's attempt at mercy, temporary pain, instead of permanent disfigurement. But there's nothing merciful about blood-soaked town squares or children watching adults reduced to screaming, broken bodies. The scaffold wasn't just where people died, it was where communities came alive. Hangings were the social event of the season, and everyone had front-row seats to death. An 1849 invoice from the Santa Fe County District Court reveals that a single hanging cost over $110, equivalent to more than $4,500 today. Territorial governments invested heavily in this theater of death, purchasing lumber for scaffold construction, paying skilled carpenters, providing coffin materials, procuring high-quality hanging rope, and covering miscellaneous supplies. These weren't hasty affairs carried out in dark corners. They were carefully orchestrated public ceremonies that drew thousands of spectators. Families brought children as an educational experience, arriving with picnic baskets to make a day of it. The festive atmosphere surrounding executions reveals a disturbing truth. Death had been normalized as entertainment, and spectators rarely missed the show. Professional executioners took pride in their craft. George Malladin, known as the Prince of Hangmen, oversaw at least 60 executions over 2 decades. He insisted on rope exactly 1.5 inches thick, soaked and air-dried before being tallowed or soaped to ensure proper flexibility. The noose had to be positioned precisely on the left side of the prisoner's neck to render them unconscious quickly. Malladin took professional pride in clean executions, as if there were an artistry to killing. Death had become a skilled trade with technical specifications and standards of excellence. Condemned prisoners were allowed final words, and their responses varied dramatically. In 1850, one of 5 Cayuse Native Americans hanged in the Oregon Territory asked a haunting question. Did not missionaries teach us that Christ perished to save his people? Oh, the irony cut deep, using the Christian teachings of his executioners to question the very civilization that was killing him. But even professional hangmen couldn't guarantee clean deaths. In 1901, Black Jack Ketchum's execution went catastrophically wrong when miscalculated rope length or drop distance resulted in complete decapitation. His head separated from his body in front of a massive crowd, rendering the attending doctor's presence unnecessary. The horror of that moment revealed the truth beneath the procedural veneer. This scientific process was still barbaric guesswork dressed up in professional language. These legal executions, however theatrical, represented attempts to establish formal justice in territories transitioning from lawless frontier to organized society. But the transition was grotesque. Society was trying to become civilized by making death as public and traumatizing as possible. Hangings weren't hidden away in prison yards, they happened in town squares at noon. They were announced in newspapers, they were events. And that tells us everything about what frontier society valued, not just justice, but the spectacle of justice. Not just punishment, but the terror of punishment witnessed by every man, woman, and child. Some punishments killed the body. Others killed any chance of the person inside that body ever rejoining society. Ear and nose cropping created living ghosts, people so visibly marked that communities rejected them on sight. The practice came directly from colonial traditions, where even minor crimes like hog stealing could result in ear mutilation. The procedure varied, but never in cruelty. Some had their ears nailed to pillory boards, forced to stand motionless for hours before the ears were severed to release them, prolonged terror before mutilation. Others had their ears cropped close with sharp instruments, with no anesthesia and healing that took weeks with high infection risk. In 1755, in Charles County, Maryland, a young African-American woman convicted of perjury faced the full horror of cumulative punishment. Placement in the pillory for public humiliation, flogging for physical pain, and ears cropped close for permanent disfigurement. Race, gender, and brutality converged in her suffering. Nashville's first horse thief in 1793 received an even more elaborate sentence from Judge John McNary under the Cumberland Compact. Fastened to wooden stocks for 1 hour, 39 lashes, ears severed, and cheeks branded. Multiple punishments layered together, each compounding the cruelty of the last. Nose cropping, though less common, appeared for particularly heinous offenses. It proved even more disfiguring than ear removal, affecting breathing, eating, and speech, rendering faces inhuman in both appearance and function. These mutilations ensured that criminals could never escape their past. Their disfigurement announced their crimes to every person they encountered. They became permanent social exiles, walking, breathing, but never truly alive in any community. After their sentence was complete, the real punishment was just beginning. A lifetime of rejection, starvation, and ostracism. With no employment opportunities, no ability to marry or form families, and no path to redemption, many faced death through suicide or starvation. Others became desperate criminals with nothing left to lose, the very monster society feared it was preventing. Frontier society wanted to make examples of criminals, to create walking warnings. But what they actually created were monsters, not because of what these people did, but because of what was done to them. You can't mutilate someone's face, mark them as subhuman, and then expect them to rejoin humanity. The punishment didn't just mark the criminal, it marked the society that inflicted it. So what do we do with this history? How do we hold both truths? that frontier communities genuinely feared for their survival and that they committed systematic atrocities in survival's name. The practical defense holds weight. Formal law enforcement genuinely couldn't reach these territories. Horse theft could mean death for entire families. Murder went unpunished without community intervention. News traveled at horse speed, making visible punishments the only communication that could span vast distances. But necessity doesn't justify excess. The speed precluded mercy. The public spectacle revealed sadistic pleasure beyond deterrence. Children were normalized to brutal violence. Permanent disfigurement eliminated any possibility of redemption. As territories matured into states throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, these brutal practices gradually faded. Prisons were built, law enforcement professionalized, courts developed due process, and public torture ceased. But the transition was incomplete. Cultural trauma persisted for generations. Many towns still celebrated their hanging judges as local heroes. The violence was romanticized in mythology rather than reckoned with in memory. We look back at frontier justice with horror, confident in our moral superiority. But are modern justice systems fundamentally different, or have we simply learned to hide the violence behind prison walls where nobody brings picnic baskets? Each branded cheek, each cropped ear, each body swinging from the gallows carried a message that required no written law to understand. As territories matured, these practices faded, replaced by imprisonment and less visible forms of punishment. Yet their legacy persists in our collective memory of the Wild West, reminding us that civilization's veneer proved thin indeed on the American frontier, where survival often demanded a terrible price from those who challenged the fragile social order. The real question isn't whether frontier justice was brutal. It obviously was. The real question is whether we've actually evolved past it, or whether we've simply gotten better at hiding what we're willing to do to people in the name of order and safety.